2016, the Queensland Government ordered a review into Queensland's parole system. A key recommendation from the review was to establish a new, independent and professional parole board in Queensland. Peter Shields is a successful criminal lawyer and former criminal investigator who was appointed to the Queensland Parole Board as its Deputy President in July 2017. He joins us on this podcast to share his thoughts about parole, his role on the board and his own justice journey. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for joining us on this Justice Journey podcast for Law Week.
That's my pleasure.
Okay, so you've had a highly successful career as a leading criminal lawyer and you're now Deputy President of Parole Board Queensland. Has law always been a passion of yours?
Oh, the short answer is yes.
Yeah.
I left school. When I matriculated from school, I went straight to the police academy because I was young and wanted to join the police force as it was back then. And I spent a period of 14 years in the police and 10 and a half years as a detective. I very much enjoyed that aspect of my career, and I studied law whilst I was as a member of the police service, and I was a detective, and spending a few years in the homicide squad and the armed robbery squad, and I got exposed to a certain side of life that not many people get to see, and so I was keen to academically explore it. So I was fortunate enough to be accepted into Queensland University of Technology, and I very much enjoyed the law and studying law, and then I ended up becoming a defence lawyer, as most people know me as, and then in June I got a phone call from the Minister asking me whether I'd like to become a Deputy President of the Parole Board.
So, as you said, you are a respected criminal lawyer. What inspired the move to Parole Board to go from, I suppose, representing offenders to judging whether they should be granted parole and go back into the community?
Well, it's a good question. I guess through my professional career, I've been fortunate that I've investigated and arrested persons for a significant period of time, and then I defended persons for a greater period of time. So I've seen both sides, and I understand through reading Justice Sofronoff's report that there was going to be significant change, and it's a change that really has the best interests of all members of the community at heart. It wants to ensure that is, Parole Board Queensland wants to ensure that persons who are released in a way that maximises their prospects of successfully rehabilitating, and of course that makes the community a safer place all around. Yep. So having read the report and spoken at length with Michael Byrne QC, I was very keen to assist in any way I can.
You've mentioned about the Queensland Parole System review. You are a new parole board. Is there anything you think you'll do differently to the previous board?
The previous board, and it should be pointed from the outset, the previous board worked very hard, but it was a system, as Justice Sofronoff referred to, that hadn't really changed for a very significant period of time. We're fortunate that the Palaszczuk government has allocated significant funds for us to change, and that's what we're doing. Probably the most difficult aspect of the new role was that when we all started on the 3rd of July, we were parachuted, if you will, into the old system. So we are changing the system from within, and we're doing it whilst also sitting on literally hundreds of parole hearings a week, or deciding parole matters a week. So that's allowed us to see from within what works and what doesn't work. Yeah. And so we are very excited about change, and the corrective services staff that are with us have embraced that.
Has it been a challenge to move over to this way of working compared to what you're used to as a criminal lawyer?
The short answer is yes. It's been an eye-opener for me personally, reading the files and understanding the depth of some of the issues that are out there in the communities, like domestic violence, for instance. Mm-hmm. That was the one aspect of my new position which deeply shocked me, that there is so much domestic violence in the community, so much extreme domestic violence in the community, and so much repeat domestic violence. And that's something that I know the government has spent a lot of money on, and it's certainly something that I can see needs that sort of attention.
It's interesting that you say that doing this parole role has left you shocked, because I would have thought through your career in the police and as a criminal lawyer, you'd almost be unshockable by now. I mean, you must have seen and heard a lot what the general public wouldn't be privy to. So there's still that element of, I suppose, learning on the job about humans and what they can do.
I think there's always that. I mean, one of the difficulties, I guess, with spending a life in criminal law, whether you're a prosecutor or defence counsel or solicitor, or you're the front line as a police officer, is that there is moments of abject brutality that affect so many people's lives. There's also absolute acts of kindness.
Yeah.
And so when you say shocked, what shocked me with domestic violence was simply the extent of it going on in the community. It has been quite concerning, working out what we can do best to try and ensure that those that are released on parole who have a history of domestic violence and inevitably receive sentences of imprisonment where they are going to be released, that there are steps in place to protect the aggrieved, but also to allow this person to reintegrate back into the community.
If you are assessing an offender for parole, what do you look for, and what are you assessing them on?
Well, the highest priority is risk. The highest priority for the Parole Board Queensland is to identify what risk this particular person poses, and we need to protect the community. That's our statutory obligation. That's something we take very seriously. So if the risk is too great, then that person will not be granted parole at this stage. One of the great misconceptions about parole is that it's an easy option and that it's all about the prisoner. It's not all about the prisoner, it's actually all about the community. Justice Sofronoff, in his Queensland Parole System Review, said the only purpose of parole is to reintegrate a prisoner into the community before the end of a prison sentence to decrease the chance that the prisoner will ever reoffend. The only rationale for parole is to keep the community safe from crime. That quote has found its way into the ministerial guidelines, and it's one of the guiding principles that the Parole Board Queensland applies when considering whether or not to release an offender on parole.
So do you think that the general public have an understanding of what parole is about?
I think it's difficult for the public in this 24/7 world where there is sensational media, and so I think sometimes the real message and the real rationale for parole gets lost. But I am a member of the community, I live in the community, and I know that the majority of the community, I think, are very receptive to the thought that a person who has served their time should be reintegrated back into the community and be a functioning member of community.
Yep.
And that's, as the High Court said, as Justice Sofronoff said, that's in the best interest of the community.
So there are misunderstandings about parole. One of the misunderstandings is that the Parole Board is responsible for all parole decisions, but that's not actually the case in Queensland, is it?
No, Queensland has two types of parole. There's board-ordered parole, which is what the Parole Board Queensland does, and then there's court-ordered parole. And court-ordered parole means what it says. It's when the court, as part of the sentence, orders that prisoner to be released on parole. And that's something that Parole Board Queensland has no involvement in, unless, of course, that prisoner gets returned to prison.
How often do people get granted parole first time?
It's a good question.
Because there seems to be, again, a misconception that, it's easy to get parole, but is that the case?
Well, it's easy to get parole if you have being sent to a term of imprisonment, and you have acceptable custodial behaviour, that is, that you're not breaching any of the prison rules, that you have organised accommodation for your release, and certainly if you've organised employment and you have family support waiting for you, then in accordance with the guidelines, you'd assess that the risk is quite low and that person would be a suitable candidate for parole. One of the difficulties that Parole Board Queensland encounters, though, is that a lot of prisoners come from very marginalised backgrounds. A lot of prisoners struggle with substance abuse, and a lot of prisoners have literally been in and out of prison most of their life. And so we have to assess, using the ministerial guidelines, the risk that that prisoner poses to the community if released. And the appetite for risk may slightly vary. If you've got a youthful offender who has a history of substance abuse, then we would like to see that youthful offender be paroled to a live-in rehabilitation facility so that they can deal with their addiction. And we have successes with that. But we also have failings, and that's why it's very important for the public to understand that a professional board member is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to be contactable to suspend a person who's on parole.
Do you feel the weight of responsibility of being on the parole board?
I think everyone who works for Parole Board Queensland does, because like all aspects of the criminal justice system, we all live in the community. Yeah. We all have spouses in the community. We all have children in the community. We have relatives in the community. And none of us likes to think that with what we do, we're putting at risk the community, because that's where our loved ones reside and work and go about their business. The reality is, though, that we're dealing with human beings who by their very nature are unpredictable and sometimes do things that, when one looks at it rationally, one cannot really understand or fathom why that person has done that. But what Parole Board Queensland does strive to do is, for every application, we give it 100% of our attention. We make sure we have the best evidence before us, and we always have at the forefront of our mind the risk to the community. That is there a risk to the community? Because community safety is our number one concern. In saying all of that, we all agonise over making sure that we get it right, and that's what we try and do.
How do you separate yourself from the subject matter? Like, you've seen all sorts over the course of your career. Can you go home at the end of the day and go, I don't have to think about that anymore? Or do you generally, I don't know, when you see the worst in human behaviour, how do you leave that in the office at the end of the day?
Well, I'm lucky because I've spent my entire adult working life in criminal law, so I don't know anything else. And I don't say that flippantly, that's just the truth of the matter. Going through my days as a detective, I was a general duties detective. I spent a number of years in the sexual offences squad. I spent a number of years in the homicide squad, a number of years in the armed robbery squad, a number of years in the major crime squad. So I guess what I'm saying is that I have seen pretty much it all. Yeah. So I think I'm still relatively intact. And I have a very functional relationship with my wife and my children. I like to think I do. So I think the fact that they still talk to me is a good sign that I don't take it home. Yeah. But it's something that we're all aware of, and that's where I think we're very fortunate to have such a person as president as Michael Byrne QC, who has not just a very well-known intellect, but he's also spent his entire life in criminal law, defending and then before that prosecuting. And then Julie Sharp, the deputy president, is a very experienced barrister and again spent her professional life in criminal law. So we support each other. Yeah. We talk a lot. and we ensure that Parole Board Queensland has the support it needs to make sure that the job's done correctly.
Well, Peter, thank you.
You're welcome.
For joining us for our justice journey.
My pleasure.